Okay, let's make a start. I think most people are here. All the seats seem to be taken. It's great to see so many people here. My name is Scott McCracken. I'm a painter and I'm also the curator of the exhibition. And this is Nick Willing. Nick is a filmmaker, a writer and director. He most recently made 2 art documentaries, Paula Rego Secret and Stories and Unstoppable, Sean Scully and the Art of Everything, which have both received critical acclaim. Nick is also the son of Paula Rego and Victor Willing, and he manages their estates. Can everyone hear me at the back? Is that, yeah, all good? Perfect. So first I'd like to just say thanks to Nick and to the family for supporting the exhibition and our publication. Turps is a relatively small artist-run independent organisation, and we really do rely on the support and the goodwill and cooperation of artists and artists' families to be able to put on what we consider to be museum quality exhibitions. So the format for today will be a very informal conversation between Nick and I about Victor's paintings, the exhibition, art in general, and then at the end there will be an opportunity for you to ask any questions or to offer your comments about the work. I should also briefly mention that there is a companion exhibition in Hastings, which is a retrospective of Victor's life. It has paintings from the early 50s, when he was at the Slade, all the way through to the final painting he made in 1987. And it really is worth the trip down to see them, because a lot of these paintings haven't been seen for a very long time, and who knows when they'll be seen again. So while the Hastings show is more of an overview, our show is much more targeted to a specific period in his life, the years 1976 through to 1985, what I would characterise as the visionary and post-visionary paintings. There are some paintings that do sit outside that. The one at the entrance, which is Matisse's Sideboard with Knife, was painted in 1974, 2 years prior. But I think that's a good sort of entry point into our discussion, because that was quite a sort of big year for the family. You moved back from Portugal to London, and Victor started painting again after quite a long hiatus. Is that?
Yes.
Yeah, in 1974.
So we had...
You would have been, what, 13, 14?
I was 13. We had the revolution in Portugal, because Portugal was a fascist dictatorship. And we had the 25 de Abril, which was the Carnation Revolution in 74, which was fantastic. Unbelievably, I can't tell you how amazing that felt. But it coincided with us losing everything. So it was a bittersweet memory, because we lost our house. We became bankrupted. And my father became very ill with multiple sclerosis. And he sort of lost my mum as well, because she found somebody else to hang out with who had money and traveled the world. And so when he moved back here with me, he put me in a boarding school in Dorset, which was very traumatic experience. I had to learn to speak English, and I had to understand the English. I don't know if anyone here knows any English people, but they're very weird. And then when he lost everything and he had nothing else that he could turn to, and he was on crutches, that's when he decided to paint again, because he'd had a sort of painter's block for 20 years prior to that.
He had some success after he left the Slade. There was the show at the Hanover Gallery in '55. but pretty much from that point onwards, he seemed to have this anxiety about the work, about originality, about what he should paint, how he should paint it, how you sort of assign meaning and sort of content to the paintings.
Yes, I think the Slade, the rather, I mean, art schools can be amazing places, obviously, they are amazing places, but they can also restrict they can make you self-conscious once you've left them, I think, or at least this is how he saw it, is that when he left, and he had been a big star at the Slade, he had introduced the Slade to Francis Bacon, who came and taught there because he became a good friend of Francis Bacon. His best friend at the Slade was Mike Andrews, who was also a very extraordinary artist. He became, as David Sylvester, the art critic of the time, described him, the spokesman of his generation, Victor Willey. So he had become a kind of intellectual who was able to talk about painting in a way that nobody, and understand. He had a gift. I mean, this is something I noticed quite early on. He had an amazing gift for being able to explain the most complex ideas, art ideas or philosophical ideas, things that you wouldn't possibly understand normally, but in a simple way, in a sentence or two. And I think that's a sign of a great intellectual, actually. You don't overcomplicate things. And so, but I think all of this is that when he then moved to Portugal, because he was starving, he had no money, he came from a very poor background. And when he met my mother, she came from a very wealthy Portuguese family. And so he took up with her because I think he quite liked her, but also because he was broke and starving. I mean, he would have died if he'd stayed in England, no question about it. And but I think then what happened was that he needed to feel that he understood and could explain what his paintings meant. And I think this is the biggest mistake he made, or according to him, is that unless he could rationalize, analyze his work, and set it against what he believed up until then was the way painting was traveling, or the way painting should be traveling.
Because at the Slade, it was very much about sort of factual observation, working from life.
It was, there had been a revolution just in the 50s. I mean, the Slade was preoccupied with Euston Road and Bill Coldstream. Ewan moved there, Ewan Newglow, also a good friend. But Dad and serious artists thought that was all bullshit. They didn't really take that seriously. But there was also a movement to try and understand, and Bacon was part of that movement, and they used photographs quite a lot, and so did Mike Andrews, to try and understand what the moment meant, how to capture the moment, the feeling of the moment, the violence of the moment, how best to capture that, either through, and photographs were important. I'm sure you all know about this period in the 1950s. And it was quite a revolutionary period, but painting was moving into an area that it was then sabotaged and became pop art, unfortunately. I think unfortunately, because pop art, whatever you say about pop art, it lost the kind of intellectual depth and the emotional depth that they were going for.
But he also saw the big abstract expressionism show at the Tate, I think in the late 50s.
Yeah, which he thought was amazing.
Yeah, I think it obviously, looking around the room now, the scale of these paintings seem to sort of borrow from that period. the sort of monumental Abex paintings. Do you think that was in any way? Because he never painted. I mean, most of the paintings that he had, he was doing prior to 1976 were all relatively sort of modestly sized paintings, similar to the one Matisse's Sideboard with Knife. But there was this sudden sort of.
I think that's right. I hadn't really thought about it that way. But now that you mention it, he wrote a very important article at the time, in 1954, I think it was, after Pollock was killed in a car crash, called Thoughts After a Car Crash, about Jackson Pollock. And in the article, he compares Pollock to a Rococo painter. And why does he compare it? And of course he explains that by saying that the Rococo artist, because the Rococo was a time when things could not be worse in Europe. Plague, pestilence, war, constant war, folding into another war, folding into a plague, poverty, terrible leadership and government. It wiped out large, it was a horror. Borders kept shifting. And the artist's answer to this was the Rococo, with cherubs. And he called it the dandy in the battlefield, the painter who was beyond caring, had gone there, and now he was so beyond caring that he painted the opposite of what was true, but implied the whiff of the cannon smoke in the air of the rose garden. I think he said something like that in this article, which I'd never thought of the Rococo period in this way until I read this article, and I get it now that it was kind of a reaction to what was going on. But his point was this, that they were so beyond caring because they were so desperate that they were able to do things they had previously thought impossible. And this is a theme in his work and other great artists' work I've found, that I've read about or met or talked to or whatever, which is that you do something properly good when you can let go of the intellectual inside you, the thing that what he had previously been, the analytical, and you do something that isn't ruled by anything but isn't ruled by anything. And that's what happened in the 70s, is that when we returned here, he'd lost everything. And he was so far beyond caring that he chose to do something that he had previously thought impossible. And instead of trying to, and what happened was actually, he was sitting, he had oh God almighty, he had a studio in Stepney, which he got was free. In those days, artists got from Space Studios, no longer the case.
Yeah, changed days.
Oh my God, it was very different. 70s was an amazing time actually for supporting artists. Yeah. And Space Studios gave artists almost, I mean, they didn't really know, they saw Victor Willing was really even, but they gave him a studio, which was this big warehouse space in Stepney, freezing cold, huge windows. And he camped there in a camp bed with that fire and that chair, see that fire there? I remember that, being there. And he started painting these huge pictures when he could hardly stand, because he was so sick from MS. And but the reason he painted these pictures was he was sitting there one day and a hole opened up in the wall, and he saw that image through the wall. He saw it as if it was a theatrical set on the other side of the wall. And the whole was the frame. It was as if it was, some people wondered at the time whether it was to do with his ACTH, which was cortisone that he was taking for his MS. But it wasn't, because he'd been taking ACTH already for 10 years or something. Apparently it was described as a psychotic event.
But he had these on and off for the next 4 years until about 1980.
At least 4 years. And he saw lots of pictures through the wall. And what happened was he just painted them. He no longer asked what they meant. He had no idea what they meant. And it freed up his self-consciousness. It sort of bypassed everything. And the drawings, actually, which you see here around the corner, and there's one upstairs, I think, as well, where he'd get that down quickly, terrified it was going to disappear, which it did disappear, then they would fade and go. And so the drawings are the most accurate to the vision. And then he'd paint a picture of it, and he'd paint them this size because that's how big they appeared through the wall. And their scale is defined by their theatricality. Yeah?
Because previously he hadn't really used drawing in that way, had he? I mean, he made drawings, but they were sort of almost parallel activities. The drawings were separate from the paintings. I think Paula even talks about it, and he says that he was sort of following, she described it as all action, no foreplay, and he said that he was sort of following Francis's Bacon's line, where the canvas becomes a field of action, and that to somehow make drawings in advance somehow diminishes that approach of, I guess, attacking the canvas. And then all of a sudden there's this sort of flip where the paintings become such a sort of useful tool in making the work. But he says that he never painted from the drawings, did he?
No, the drawings were, it's to do with cementing the thing in your mind.
Yeah. So he would actually have, after the vision stopped, which was about 1980, and then he was just sort of using he became much more receptive to his imagination. And he'd have the pad, the paper in front of him, and the blank canvas would be on the wall. And he would be drawing out essentially what he would be doing on the painting, almost as a sort of rehearsal, getting to grips with the proportions of it and the scale of it, and then he would put it away and make the painting, which is just such a sort of remarkable sort of process.
And one of the things that he was very good at was colour.
Mm.
He was very good at colour. He had a brilliant. He really understood colour. I remember my mum asking at lunch once in Portugal about shadows. She didn't really know about things like how to do things properly or what you're supposed to do. She never knew anything about art, really. And but so she would ask him lots of questions about art. Of course, she's really a proper artist, actually, because the thing he eventually became, which was doing something straight from your unconscious, was what she was doing from the age of 2, but doubting herself. And what was actually good about their relationship was that he was not competitive at all. But he really helped her. He really, really helped. He helped her in her work. He also helped to try and get shows. He got her a show at the ICA in the 60s. He really championed her work, which was, I don't know, quite unusual in a relationship of that kind, I think. Anyway. But they were sitting there after, and she was asking about colour. He said, well, the shadows are the complementary colour of the light. So if the light is red, the shadow will be green. If the light is yellow, the shadow will be violet. And she said, never. That can't be right. I remember him then saying, okay, have a look. And he put a chair there, like one of these chairs. And the shadow did fall, and it was quite a warm light, and it did fall, and it was violet. And he understood colour. He understood how things are made.
Mm.
He had a good, but he had his also part of his journey was to forget that, or to not allow that. His thing was, one of his big things that he used to say to us is, if you don't try and get it right. Oh, he'd mock people for trying to get it right. And I'd go, well, what am I? Well, I thought we were supposed to get things right. He said, but that's not what he meant. He meant that if a painting looks like you've worked too hard to try and get it right, it doesn't feel authentic.
Yeah.
It feels there's some, and that's the dandy in the battlefield.
Yeah.
That's Pollock. That's where the drip paintings really come from too.
Yeah.
Their energy and power is undiluted. He's not trying to make it look like Dad's not trying to make it look like a sausage. I don't know what the fuck that is. That's Callot Cavalier. So that's a horse. This is a horse. This chair here is a horse. And this is a part of the horse here. And he doesn't know what this is. Well, what is this spice? I don't. Is it dick? The horse's dick? No, I don't think so. And then, well, where's the man? He said, that's the man with the big hat on, you see. And that's his moustache. They're quite funny, but that's his moustache. That's on a table, which is the horse. Amazing, really. Bonkers. But very, but the thing was not to try and make it look like too much like a table, I suppose.
But I think you can see a slight shifts from the work that he was doing in the late 70s. So when he was having the visions to when the visions stopped, it feels like the surface of the paintings sort of change. Yeah. If you look at, say, Night Errant, the surface is much richer, it's heavier, more work, there are layers of paint. Whereas after that, the paint becomes a lot thinner. The brush marks become a lot sort of sketchier and looser, and he really uses the white ground of the canvas underneath, almost in the same way as he'd be using the white ground of the paper when he was making the drawings. So I think if you see the paintings upstairs, they do have this incredible sort of glow to them. The white light from the ground underneath almost sort of seeps through. And you can see the workings out of things. Of Calo Haradan, there are sort of slight shifts where he moves things just ever so slightly, sort of a bit to the left or moves it up 1 or 2 inches, and just to be able to sort of see that thought process going into the paintings, that sort of consideration, and the sort of the lightness of touch that they have. I think that really
gives it a movement as well.
Yeah, and it does. I mean, he says
Keith Haring kind of before Keith Haring, but it gives it
it almost sort of vibrates.
Yeah, vibrates. This is a post-vision picture. That's a vision picture. That he actually saw that through the wall, and then he painted it. And he saw that picture and painted it, and he lived with it. And then afterwards, he needed to give it a title because paintings always have titles. It's very frustrating. I look after their estates and a number of untitles. You have to give it a number. PX473, Untitled. But he thankfully did accept the responsibility of giving a lot of his pictures titles. And he called it Knight Errant. And then he didn't know why he'd called it Knight Errant. It's a bit like psychoanalysis. And actually, painting can be like psychoanalysis. And he called it Knight Errant, and he didn't know why. And then he had to figure it out. And what he realized was this was the story that the Knight Errant was George, who kills the dragon. And then he realized actually it's a family picture. And that George is the army uniform that's hanging, and that's his dad, disembodied, hanging on a screen. And that the dragon is the fire, the gas fire, and that's his mum. And Victor is in the middle. He's the chair. Because his mum used to beat him. She was abused him as a child. And once she hung him by his braces in a closet when he was being naughty, when he was 2. And put him in the dark in a closet. He was so terrified he kicked out the door. But apparently you're not supposed to do that to children. Because it can be, being like in a sensory tank or whatever you call it, where you don't know where. So that, in a way, is the hanging uniform is evocative of that. And then the door of the room is buckled, and that's his family. They're in an unsafe room. And George, unfortunately, never slayed the dragon. But that's what that picture then becomes. So what happened was that he had this vision, he painted it, he had no idea what it meant, and in time he figured it out, gave it a title, and then talked about it and realized this is a family picture and explained it to me and others.
How long after he painted it did he start to sort of fathom out what?
It depended. That's a good question. It depended. But then after the 3 months, 4 months, but it would be one of those things that he'd sit there looking, wondering what the hell have I done and why? And he didn't want to ask too deeply because the whole breakthrough had come with him not knowing what it meant. So there was this constant battle about trying to protect the thing that gave birth to the picture. After the visions dissipated, then he painted pictures like this, and he by then was allowing his imagination to invent. He'd allowed it to invent and not questioned it. The inspiration for this picture is the 30 Years' War, which is a Rococo period, isn't it? 30 years. And so he was very interested in that period because it was such a horrible time for humanity. We did the most horrendous things. I mean, we always have done. For some reason, he connected that period as one of the most for him, because I think art at that time was doing the opposite of what the life that was being lived. I think that greatly connected with something in him that was both absurd, slightly humorous, but also tragic.
So there was this slight sort of interior-exterior thing, because he speaks about the paintings sort of being made very much for himself, but at the same time he was aware of what was happening within the art world, and he was trying to somehow perhaps address that through his work.
I think early on in the 50s, when he was writing about art and giving lectures and hanging out with Bacon and Mike Andrews, Peter Snow, Ewan Newglen, all those, David Sylvester, Roger Deacon, photographer, what's his name? Richard Deacon. He had a. I think he felt that he had a responsibility to try and channel what his generation's, the direction that his generation's art should go. I don't know why he had such an idea. It seems illusions of grandeur, but anyway, nevertheless, he did, you know. And so he wrote about it, and he was very interested in how it was developed. He met Sam Beckett, for instance. He had a meeting with Sam. Peter Snow, who had just done the set for Waiting for Godot, when it first came to London. It was first done in Paris, wasn't it? Mm. And then Peter Snow brought it, a Royal Court, I think, somewhere like that. Maybe not the Royal Court, I don't know. But anyway. And he said, you've got to meet Victor Willing. He's very interesting. Sam, I don't think he talked like that. But I don't know why. He sort of did. And so they met these two in a coffee shop in Soho. And Sam Beckett sat there, po-faced, not saying anything. So Dad started eventually, because he was also could be a man of few words, my father. And he started talking, and he told him about this picture. Tell me about I'm doing Beckett now. I don't know. Tell me about your picture. And he said, it's about a guy who's sitting at a table with a tape recorder, taping his memories, and then playing them back one by one, and then taping over them in an effort to try and change the memories. This is the story my dad tells. And Beckett sat there and said nothing, but eventually asked, why does he do that? And it's what they were preoccupied with at the time, is how to portray the moment. And in what way does memory play a part, and what way does memory corrupt the moment? You know, this is the sort of existentialists thing at the time. They were all bloody existentialists, poor sods. And of course, then Beckett, went away, and sometime later, my dad went to see a play by Beckett called Crack's Last Tape, which is about a guy, isn't it? But he said, the thing is that Beckett was already writing that play. And what was odd about this encounter, and why Peter Snow got them together, is he realized that Vic was doing a painting that was very much like Beckett's play that he was already writing. And this is the thing that my dad explains, is that it's the time that makes the art more than the artists. Do you remember reading about that?
It's
made Bacon very angry, because Francis Bacon said, well, somebody's got to bloody paint the pictures. How are you doing the way? Well, what did we just say in bed? Yeah. He kind of talked like that, Bacon.
It's odd because a lot of people, since the show has been up, a lot of people have come up to me and sort of said how fresh the paintings feel, as if they feel that they could have been painted today. And you know, as a painter, that sort of label of freshness is it's a positive description of your work, because it reflects the now. And the more I look at the paintings, they don't sort of feel fresh to me. In a way, they almost sort of go beyond that. And there's this sense of displacement. And I sort of almost imagine that they probably felt the same back in the 80s when they were painted, and they may feel the same in 20 years' time. They don't feel like they belong to a particular moment in time or to a particular place. It seems to me like if you look at sort of the history of art, at certain moments, the Egyptian Fayum portraits, Piero della Francesca, Goya, Picasso, these are paintings that actually sit outside of time. And I think sort of Victor belongs sort of in that trajectory, for me anyway. So when I think about them, I sort of see them as,
love to hear that.
I sort of see them as, as not necessarily being off the now,
Yeah.
but sort of.
Well, it was his preoccupation was that he felt that you could not escape your time. That it was impossible to escape your time. That whatever you did, you would smell of your era, and you would and you would be a sort of become the face of your era.
Okay.
I mean, that was his view. I don't think his pictures are in any way a face of this. I don't see these pictures necessarily an image of the 70s and 80s. I mean, they're paintings, which is very much an 80s thing, you know. So in that sense, that's true. And they have the kind of abandoned stroke of Philip Guston, those sort of artists, which is also of their time.
Was he aware of artists like Philip Guston?
Oh yes, he knew everybody.
Yeah.
He knew everybody, and he looked at everybody with great interest because he wrote about art too. And but to save himself, he did that less during that period because he recognized that he had to switch off his brain. You know, you have to switch off your brain.
Well, I was watching an episode of The Twilight Zone recently, oddly enough, not to go too off a tangent too much, and someone said the line, the human imagination is the greatest form of salvation. And that's really struck a chord with me thinking about these paintings. Do you think that's what it was because of he was completely giving himself over to his imagination?
I think
he wasn't questioning it, because I mean that is something that I think painters now, they sort of feel that they have to be in a position to explain themselves, to explain the work, and it's sort of if you can't do that, you're somehow you're sort of not as good an artist, because
you know my mum is also a painter, and she can't talk about her work. She's never been able to talk about her work, and on many occasions that she has talked about her work, she tends to sabotage her own work and say the exact opposite of what's going on, or she's perverse. She's a perverse. But she's a real artist. I mean, she's without meaning to be. She's born that way. She's the absolute thing of it. And
would you say that Victor is not in that same vein?
It took him a long time to allow himself the counterintuitive thing of switching off his brain. Whilst my mum never had a brain, she just went, painted everything. You know, I mean, I'm being very cruel about her, but actually I'm giving her a great compliment because this is what I come to understand from growing up with them and many other artists, because there were always bloody artists around everywhere. Never had any money. That's what it is to be an artist, I think, or how. That's the sort of dilemma of it, is that you have to. That's for them. I think that's what they grew up with, that dilemma. You know, have to juggle working from your imagination or your unconscious or whatever it is that you would describe as being the thing that you don't understand. I always thought one of my favorite quotes is from Carl Jung, who said, "The things that have the greatest hold over you are the ones you least understand." And that's what psychoanalysis is invented for. So you understand the things that have the greatest hold over you, where they come from, usually your parents, of course, and you demystify them, and then they don't have a hold on you anymore. You know, and a painter does their best work when they least understand what they're doing, it seems to me. I mean, this is my unfortunate study of my life, because I was exposed, like being exposed to radiation for so long, in the company of these two artists and many others. But it's juggling that thing of being able to do something you don't understand with the technique, I suppose you call it, with the drive and purpose of somebody who's trying to do it, you know, package it in such a way as it is a painting, or it is a sculpture, or it is a, you know what I mean? And that sort of marriage between those two possibly conflicting feelings and ideas.
It's interesting that you mentioned sort of conflicting ideas, because one of the sort of seminal texts for him was Nietzsche's The Birth of Tragedy.
Yes.
And how he talked about the Apollonian and the Dionysian.
Yes.
Do you want to sort of say something about?
Do you know what that is? Do you know Nietzsche is a philosopher, German, I think he is, bastard. And I didn't know. I once asked my dad, I came back from school and I said, we're doing existentialism. And all day he's explaining it to the teacher's explaining it to me, and I have no idea what it means. What's it mean, Dad? And he said, he used to say these things as if it was a definition from a dictionary that you could find somewhere, but of course it never was. And he just said, existentialism is every day a new beginning. Oh, every day a new beginning, I get it. Which is what the existentialists were about. Try and make every painting fresh from the start. Cut away those influences, the baggage that you carry as much as possible, and do something from the beginning. Try and be a child every time. And it seems impossible to me, but anyway, that was the idea. And anyway, Birth of the Nation, he loved.
Birth of Tragedy.
Birth of the Nation. Ku Klux Klan, isn't it? It's terrible. Birth of Tragedy is a sort of, wrote it when he was very young, Nietzsche, I think, and it's this kind of internal dialogue where he's musing the influence of Apollo and Dionysus. And the Greek religion is such that they invented gods as expressions of personality. You know? So the god Narcissus was, an expression of a narcissism, and so on. Apollo is an expression of classical art, music, painting, sculpture, the proper way of doing it.
Sort of rational, orderly.
Rational, technical classicism, the correct way of doing it. He is the highest form of artistic venture. That's Apollo, and everybody looks up to Apollo. Oh, it's the greatest of the gods, you know. Dionysus is the god of the unconscious, of the goat, of the devil, of the urges of lust, of making no sense, of God, I mean, there's a big list there. And they battle it out in Birth of Tragedy. Of course, Dionysus wins because that's what art is. Art comes from an unconscious place. if it's any good. And if you try and get it right, it'll smell wrong, it'll look wrong. You know?
So would Victor see himself more as the Apollonian or the
No, he was a Dionysian.
Okay.
He was a real Dionysian. He loved the Greek religion. I have to say, he constantly read Greek religion, and because he was inspired by their ideas, obviously, because they kind of cracked everything before we even started asking the questions in the modern world. They had already sort of answered most of them. And he considered himself to be a Dionysian. But what was ironic is he had spent most of his life questioning art and himself, like an Apollonian.
Yeah.
Well, that's a word.
And do you think that's where the sort of the geometry of the paintings sort of it becomes a recurring motif? And I think he said that geometry is a way of keeping the imagination at bay. So was that him trying to sort of almost straddle both the Apollonian and the Dionysian, and was it a sort of callback to his days at the Slade when he would do these sort of schematic doodles of circles and spheres and pyramids, and sort of thinking of Cézanne and Cézanne's observation?
Yes, I mean, he's talked about the pictures being pictures of events that have already happened or are about to happen, but aren't happening at the time. So often when you see, this is a gym, this is 3 into 2 won't go. Oh, this is aha, so there you go. So there you are. Oh yeah, that's right. Aha, this gentleman is looking in the mirror, and that lady there has fallen over. At this stage, this is a later picture, and he's decided that he's looking at geometric shapes, and is beguiled by the investment, the human investment that we place on them. So this project, so he did things like judge, which objects piled on top of each other very precariously, and if you pull out one, the whole thing will fall out down, and that's his judge, you know. And aha, so there you are, is in a sense, you can see this like a self-portrait, where he's mocking the triangle for having pushed past the cylinder to find themselves in a mirror that does not show them as they really are. Because what's in the mirror is orange and he's red. So it's both humorous and tragic painting. But the geometric shapes that you see painted on the walls of some of his pictures are to do with, I think, the ridiculousness of humanity trying to, of the guy that was in that room drawing geometric shapes on the wall, that was a ridiculous, a pathetic attempt at trying to place order in an unordered world. You know, you get that in the Surrealists too, and you get it in Alice in Wonderland, don't you? Where he makes fun of the people who try to make sense of a world that is irrational.
And the odd thing is there are no people in the paintings, but they still have this tremendous sense of presence, but it's a presence that is arrived at through an absence.
I mean, there are people, but the people...
Because it seems to me that the sort of earlier paintings, such as Knight Errant, although you can identify them once you know the story, they seem more almost like still lifes, sort of life room setups. And then as we sort of move along, sort of into the 80s, the objects become much more sort of anthropomorphized, and they actually sort of take on the persona of characters and actors.
Yeah.
And yet there are no people there.
Well, they're expressions of people, so they like, I suppose Picasso did that too.
A sort of formalised...
Yeah, that was later. The earlier pictures, the real vision pictures, the person has just left or is about to return. And so there's an uneasy feeling to the pictures.
I think...
Because of that.
Yeah, that sense of unease, and sort of going back to the Apollonian and the Dionysian, when I look at these paintings, it seems as if sort of Victor is always sort of blurring the boundaries between two different conditions or two different states. So you have this sort of interior and exterior happening at the same time. You have the sort of the complete and the fully formed with the incomplete. You have an absence and you have a presence. You have the inanimate and the animate. And it seems as if these dichotomies are sort of continually at play in the paintings, and you can't really sort of go with one or the other. It's almost a sort of paradox that they exist at the same time, simultaneously, which I think it reminds me of a quote by Andrew Forge, who your dad knew, who was not, who was not his biggest fan, and he said that painting's greatest paradox is it is both a window and a wall. And I think that this idea of windows and walls is pertinent to sort of to Victor's work.
Yeah, he I mean, he put things in rooms also because he was putting things in quite deep. He said, John McEwan in one of his interviews asked him, why is there, like for instance in that picture, there's a sort of carpet on the floor. And the carpet is then also in a room. So why are these, and there's a screen. And in a lot of these pictures, there are, he called them ediculi, which are sort of like gazebos or areas for someone to sit that's not there at the moment. And Dad said, he said, I don't know, but all I know is that one thing I learned was that if a child is being hysterical and anxious, what you can do is put your arms around them. And not tight, not necessarily hugging them, because they might not want that. But if you just put your arms around them, they will feel better. I've never tested this, but this is what he said anyway. They'll feel better because you're giving them a sense of boundary that's reassuring, because the world to a small child seems very blown open and insecure. And so he said that these constructs in my paintings are a sort of attempt to create boundaries that add a desperate sense of attempt to create a sense of security.
I guess boundary is quite a good word
when
thinking about these paintings.
And the walls, and you see that wall is buckled like a weird hall of mirrors. And so that's not very good, is it? You don't really know where you stand there, whether that's made of liquid or it's blowing in the wind. It doesn't feel a very secure place.
Yeah.
And that's the only painting in which he ever did that. And he didn't know why he did that until he worked out that it was a self-portrait of his family, which had that insecurity for him.
And so this was painted in 1983.
Yes.
And how much did the MS affect his ability to sort of physically make? It seems like such a sort of
it was hard,
difficult thing to do, and a very sort of ambitious.
He was working. I think he was then in '83. He was at Cambridge as an artist in residence, and he'd asked either me if I was there I wasn't often there. Or the, not the janitor, but
The gardener.
the gardener, to come in and turn the picture upside down so you could paint the top of it. You know, so a lot of these were painted upside down, or at least the top were. And then,
So yeah, this part would have been.
yeah. And you see, he's scribbled part of the sausage out, because if it was that thick, it wouldn't be right for the horse. I mean, I don't know how you worked that out, but it was obviously very important. But that also gives it a shimmer. You know, the way the brush stroke, it's to, and I'd like to say that it's an uncaring accident, but I think he really liked to do it that way. You know?
Yeah.
You want to get it that way. You see how the coloured in grey shadow doesn't quite get to the top of that structure, that monolith. And I think he rather liked that, because it gives it a slight sense of unease. You know?
And they feel quite, especially these ones, they feel quite quick. Although I think they're very much about this sort of slow looking, but to me they feel there's this sort of great sense of sort of urgency about them.
Yeah, I think he knew the game was up.
Yeah.
The game was soon up. You know, last picture he did was, that's one of almost the last pictures. But the last one of that series was a sort of picture of a woman that's inspired by Matisse, one of Matisse's women. That's the Don's daughter. That's a sort of gangster's mole. But the last picture he did, he said he knew he was going to this was going to be his last picture.
Okay.
And so he thought, okay, I can probably just do one more, because by then he was paralyzed. Most of his body was paralyzed, lying in bed, and he put the end of the brush in his mouth, and he'd hold the end of the brush with it between his thumb and his finger like this. And Leela, who is his carer, who's now still works for my mum, so her model and the studio assistant, would hold the canvas up on his legs, you know, on the bed, and he would go like this and paint it. When you look at the pictures, you can hardly believe that's how they're done, actually. But I remember seeing him doing it. And he's doing it, and he makes it look like he wanted it to look. So it wasn't, you don't see the difficulty in his painting. But in that picture, he didn't want it to be a sad picture, because it was his last picture. And he was a man who had spent a lot of his life not painting pictures. And now that he really wanted to paint pictures, he couldn't.
But you did have the big retrospective at the Whitechapel in '86. What did that sort of, how did he feel about that? What does it mean to him?
That was fantastic. You know, everybody said he was washed up when he came back from Portugal. And then he got ill and he had no money and his wife had gone off. And, you know, he was in a bad state. But he never felt sorry for himself or complained, but he just got on with it. And then Nick Sirota did a retrospective at the Whitechapel, because Nick Sirota was running the Whitechapel. And wow, that was a big moment. Here was this guy, by then crippled, in a wheelchair, being wheeled around the paintings of his life. Actually, mostly just this later period, but some of his earlier period pictures. And it made it worthwhile. You know, if you live long enough, good things happen. He died just at 59, 60, so he didn't live long enough. But he lived just long enough. You know? And
do you think that had he lived beyond that he would be one of those sort of names of British art, the sort of Auerbachs, the Freuds?
I've no doubt.
Yeah.
I've no doubt. Part of the thing is, if there are any painters here, make sure you live long. because it really makes all the difference. Also, you tend to get better, I think, as you get older. Dad said to me once when I was having trouble making a film at film school, I got into the National Film School, I was very, very young. I was 17, and everybody else was in their 30s because it was a postgraduate course. It was a ridiculous situation. And I didn't quite know what film to make, and he said, and I'd written something that was mad, and he said, well, you're only ever any good when you're too young to know any better or too old to care anymore. So you might as well go for it. I thought that was brilliant. So I did. It was a disaster. But anyway, I did do that. And but I think that happens to you as you get older and you start to, or you allow yourself to let go of your brain, one thing, in his case that was important, or B, let go of the trappings of what you see as the art world around you, which is a complex and difficult and absurd and sabotaging world, I think, isn't it?
Yeah, definitely.
That
hasn't changed.
No. It's got worse, perhaps, in that respect. Yeah.
So do you think he ever thought about his sort of legacy, of what would happen to the pictures after he wasn't around?
He said, try and sell them wisely, told me. So I didn't sell them at all, because I had no idea what that meant. Wisely. How do you sell the fucking... I think he means in MoMA.
Yes.
You know, to MoMA. I haven't been able to sell them to MoMA, so I've just kept most of them.
We'll happily have them here for as long as you want us to.
These belong to us. That one's on my wall. But the ones upstairs, some of them are owned by, Pallant House, the Arts Council, the Tate have 3 or 4. And they are in some good collections. But
well, hopefully this and the Hastings show will sort of reintroduce him to...
I hope so.
Yeah. That seems like a good place to sort of end and to invite any questions or comments, if anyone has anything, if anyone's sort of itching. Yeah.
I just think I'm quite interested in this, obviously, this break when he went to Portugal. Did he speak any Portuguese when
he learned Portuguese fluently. Learned it fluently, yeah.
Okay.
With a terrible accent.
No, it seems to me this struggle with the Apollonian brain sort of side of things and letting go of that. Surely that passage in Portugal and even the coming back, having sort of lost everything in many ways, seems like a sort of perfect rebirth in terms of the letting go of lots of things.
Yes, I think he when he got there, he had this beautiful house, sunshine, beautiful wife, little kiddies, people to look after him, fantastic food, great wine, disgusting wine, but great wine. And he thought, fuck it, I made it. What do I have to, I made it already. He thought if you were a painter, you'd work until you got all that, and then you could just rest on your laurels. But he got that at the beginning. So that added an extra level of confusion. It's not one that I think today we would struggle with, because I think a person of his, I think in those days you could be really broke. I mean, he ate one meal every 2 days.
I more meant that while in the previous time in London at the Slade, he was really broke. At the same time, he was obviously intellectually very, very brilliant, very respected. He was having these conversations about painting and analysing them. And going to Portugal, as wonderful and luxurious as the surroundings might have been, was a letting go of that mastering via language and communication.
Didn't him spending time in Portugal make him sort of reminisce about his childhood in Alexandria, in Egypt?
The smells, that connected with him. He was, at the time, my mother was taken to task and criticised by his contemporaries. for taking Victor away to a third world country full of Dagos. And the British were horrible those days. Not anymore, of course. And I remember him thinking that there was a lot of sort of prejudice against Portuguese, and that he was in this backboard and he couldn't possibly become a great artist if he was living there. And that was more dominant than the fact that actually he found somewhere that he could work without fear of going hungry. And actually the other thing is that when you have got that possibility, you also do ask yourself, what the hell am I going to do? What happened was he did a whole load of very imaginative pictures, some of which we never showed. And I've shown 3 of them at the Hastings Gallery, which have something to do with these pictures. And he did those in the 60s. Upstairs, those.
Yes.
They're very similar to this.
The 2 Untitled, the sort of orangey, yellow
Yeah,
ones that have. Yeah, because even though it was well before the visions even started, you can sort of identify certain things that then reappeared later on in the sort of visionary paintings, sort of platforms and forms hanging and balancing and fabric. And
objects and strange objects, and you look at it and you think, is it an animal? Is it a machine? What the hell is this thing? And they're big pictures, and he rolled them up and put them on the roof of his car, Renault Floride, and he drove it to London, and he restretched them and put them on his wall in Albert Street. We had a house in Albert Street, which was cheap in those days, in the 60s, late 50s, and invited Andrew Forge to come and look at them, who he greatly respected. He was a very good, close friend. They'd been together at the Slade. He was an art critic, also a painter, and he was horrified. And he said, Vic, you've gone mad. Go back and paint the figure. This is bullshit. This is shit. I mean, he was that tough. And Vic, who was, I think, deeply insecure, actually, unstretched them, rolled them up, put them back on the roof of his Floride, drove back to Portugal and destroyed some of them. We managed to take off him, or my grandmother did, before he destroyed them. But nobody had, and then he never showed anyone else. It was just fucking Andrew Forge, which was a shame, because I think that had been a breakthrough already of sorts. And it set him back 10 years, And that was a waste. And
so really he had he had that moment early in his life where had he not gone to Portugal, he could have actually sort of been in that league with the painters at the time.
Well, but it was a horrible world.
Yeah.
But yeah, possibly. I mean, he was going back and forth quite a lot.
Yeah.
And he said to Mum eventually, we've got to get you to England because you will never become a painter if you stay in Portugal. And he was right about that. So he tried to get her shows here, but his efforts were more in trying to get her shows than himself shows. Odd.
Who was that critic? Who was it?
Andrew Forge.
Where is he now?
Dead. I didn't kill him. It wasn't me, Gov. No, he died actually about...
Didn't he go to America?
He went to America.
To Yale.
He never really had huge success as a painter.
I rest my case.
Yeah. But it's funny who you trust. You be careful who you trust. I think is that the lesson in that one. And he shouldn't have. I mean, it shows as an insecure... Actually, it's a story that tells you more about my dad than it does about Andrew Forge in a way, that he would allow that to have influenced him as much as it did. So,
Quite.
Because you look at his skill and look up to him, and he himself had that insecurity. But I think it's like, you know, your art form is like your child in a way, and you know, you're nervous about it, and to give it over to somebody else, and then
They trash it. Must be very
yeah, I think it's really.
I'm struck by what you said about the vision, about the punching a hole in the wall, and then sort of seeing the painting complete on the other side. I mean, a lot of the painters of his generation talked a lot about surface. You know, it's always a dialogue between surface and depth or illusion. I mean, and when I look at the paintings, it's possible to characterize them as not having much real concern with the quality of surface. It might be partly the urgency with which he wanted to put things down. But I just wondered if he ever sort of expressed any concern or any interest really in the quality of the surface.
I think that actually, I know what you mean, but they are very, and I'm glad you say that they seem unpreoccupied with that, but they are very preoccupied in the sense that he layered colours and painted over them in such a way that the background colour would come through and give a sense of either a shimmer or a translucent quality to a surface, a wall, or
I think the painting where I really notice it is night with the boat in the basement, and you can really see the sort of purpley greens coming through. You can see it a little bit in this painting here that there are things happening underneath, but most of the work in the show, because it's sort of from the 80s onwards, I think it does, he's using I mentioned earlier, he's using the sort of the white ground of the support much more, and it gives it this sort of luminosity, but I don't think he was sort of overpainting the sort of the later pictures in the same way as he would have been doing with the earlier ones.
No, I think he's creating a scene with the earlier ones. He's trying to give a sense and expression to what he saw beyond the wall.
And these were things that he would have seen, so they would have had that sort of, they would have felt quite tangible to him in a way, because he was, and it lasted for about 20 minutes, the visions. So it wasn't just a sort of snap, he was sort of really in there.
They were moving. So, yes, you.
A very quick question. I was interested to hear that he met Beckett.
Yes.
I've for a long time been intrigued by the theatricality of the work.
Yes.
And wondered if he had any other relationships with theatre or particular interest with theatre, which is also quite visionary.
Yes, he didn't. I mean, he loved the theatre. But I can't recall him ever having any dealings with that. I mean, when I was young, I used to make films. I mean, I still make films, but you know, and he'd look at them with enormous interest because he shared an interest in sets and things.
That's what I was thinking.
Yeah, they do seem.
And even the creation of the characters.
Yeah.
Was cobbling together. And
yeah, they're very they are very theatrical. He did describe them as being theatrical paintings.
Probably to me, the place where his work overlaps the most with Paul Arrigo is that theatricality.
Yeah.
So can I ask about the relationship with sculpture? He studied sculpture.
Yes.
So it's between those two worlds.
Yes.
And these to me feel very much like these are forms in
Yeah.
space.
Yeah. I think Marcus mentioned that the other day. That he did start as a sculptor at Guildford, and then he was accepted into the Slade as a sculptor, and then became a painter.
So they're very tangible in that way, aren't they? Everything's defined.
Yeah.
There's no obfuscation. And in a funny way, everything you mentioned boundaries, you know, everything's held, the colour's held, the shape's definite.
Yeah.
So
They have a real sort of clarity, sort of candidness about them, but yeah, at the same time there's also that slight ambiguity and elusiveness because you don't quite know what's going on, but everything is very much sort of in its place.
But it's strangely in its place. And in a way that I feel Bacon is as well, for all this idea that Bacon is a painterly painter, that they're still quite contained and held, you know, in the relationship with these and Matisse and Picasso, who are all sculptors as well. But I guess they do something maybe different, I don't know if it's fair to say, but there's an expansion where colour can be freed from the object, from the motif, you know, for the sake of the painting. But these feel very defined, and I don't know. I mean, you know, this is new for me, seeing these in the flesh. You know, so I'm trying to figure out how the colour.
I mean, they have
changes as
they have a very strong atmosphere. He was very keen to create a very strong atmosphere, and also a story of sorts. I mean, not like a Rego painting story, but they do have stories because something has just happened in that room. This cylinder has just fallen over, you know. Now, I mean, there's the uneasiness suggests that the story has just happened or is about to happen. And I think that sculpture has a connection with a sense of place, doesn't it? Because a sculpture lives in a place, or it is an expression of a place. And these paintings do have very much a sense of place.
Yeah. So what I'm trying to understand is, did he actually make maquettes?
He did. No, not in that sense. No. He did drawings. He did make some maquettes. He thought about making some sculpture, quite brightly coloured sculptures that were similar to these. He didn't do paintings of them though. They were just to be sculptures. And he did something called ediculi. I don't know, it's a Greek word, pompous thing. But they were structures, buildings, that were very carefully designed and built, and they were designed for you to sit in them. He was obsessed. He told me once that if you put a razor blade, in the very center of a pyramid inside, it will always stay sharp. Do you hear that story? And that's why the Egyptians put their mummified bodies in the very center, because they believed that would be the shape has preserves the. I didn't know that. And he built structures not where you would be preserved, but where if you sat in it, they were repositories for the self, he calls it. So that there were places to sit.
Mm.
Can I just say, the painting here represents a clarity. It's almost sublime for me. I don't see it as, I think you said, it's urgently drawn. I think compared to all the others, there's something of that stillness, or that even with this kind of odd choice of shapes and forms, there's something for me that is sublime. It's like a moment of stillness where he's so sure about what he's putting down. There's no question about what he
That's very true. That's what I think what Scott was referring to is that the manner in which it's painted gives the impression that it's painted.
I've referred to it as a still restlessness in the text. It does have that because there are no figures. There's no sort of moment of frozen action, because it's essentially objects in space. So in a sense, there's actually greater potential for movement, because nothing seems frozen. It is almost as if
Yeah.
you are sort of observing something, sort of just objects that sort of
It's
are.
quite mummified, it's
Yeah.
so organic, it's so, to me, strangely very real, and it's unmannered. It's almost, it's a kind of perfection which surprises me, because in other ways I might think it's a bit clunky, but it represents something very still.
Well, there's good. I think there's three questions. Just I'm conscious of the time, so.
It's a comment,
Yeah.
it's a continuation of what
Yeah.
the person you was saying. It's extremely interesting when you're talking about the way that the grey doesn't quite fill up the column that the painting's right. There's an extremely kind of accretion of uncertainties in the painting. You know, the wobbliness of the line, the bits of
Yeah.
pigment that transgress where they've been put, the spike which is added afterwards, and the thinness of the pigment which allows us to see the table behind it. And it's as if the poetry of the piece actually resides in that incredibly kind of intentional and certain and poetic manipulation of those very uncertainties. It's actually quite interesting sitting here, looking at it like sometimes and listening to stuff I really appreciate.
Well, that's the thing. It's
Unusual and wonderful
it's
piece.
not the sort of thing that you would perhaps identify when you first look at it, and it's just through that sort of that engagement with it. And it's the same upstairs with the Callot. You'll see, I think, the sort of the artist term would be sort of pentimento, which is sort of these changes of decision, and they're not massive changes. They're just slight tweaks of just moving things a few inches one way or the other, but it somehow gives the painting its sort of identity and its presence. Oh, sorry.
Following from that, from Michael, how's the condition affecting this painting and what Michael's just been saying in terms of his dexterity and control? Because are these, I mean, I recognise these, what you're talking about. What's the word for changes?
Pentimento.
I recognise them as kind of post-abstract figuration, sort of Engost and late Picasso, maybe in Hill. So I can sort of put these in history. But without the condition, would David have thought that he could make these paintings crisper or better?
No.
Was this all bedded into a sensibility that preceded the condition?
It was on purpose, completely on purpose. And if he'd wanted it to be sharper or more accurately defined, he would have done that. He was never, remember, throughout his life, he would paint over and over and over a picture, never satisfied. And but he was always trying to get to this effortlessness. There's a painting that he did of a cousin of mine, Manuela. She's now in her 80s, when she was 14 or something. And she's lying on a bed, and it looks like a Velasquez. It's complete. Just by doing this, he's captured the light and the glass just on the edge of the reflection. And, you know, he could do it completely, exactly, effortlessly. He had that ability if he wanted to. And so this is very much as he intended. He wanted it to give it that kind of, you know, as if he hadn't really worried about trying too hard.
Question.
So it's a beautiful portrait painted by your father, and it's sort of Paula when she was a young woman, which was mostly white. I was wondering if you had any memories of him talking about either painting that picture or what it meant to him. And also you said that he had a painting block for 20 years, so he didn't paint. And I was curious, does that mean he didn't draw at all? Do you have any memory of him?
He took over the family business because he felt that my grandfather died and we were in Portugal. My grandfather's Portuguese, and my dad thought, well, I'll pay him back for all the things he's done to me by taking over his business and making a success of it. And when I have enough money, then I can live as I want to live and paint and not worry about having to make money at painting. And he made a complete hash of it. He made a complete hash of running an electronics business. I mean, you know, in Portugal, with Portuguese. Then the revolution came, and of course he was, even though he'd been fighting for the revolution all his life, as my mother had, he was, because he was running this business, he was identified as the you know, the fascist pig and run out of, literally chased down the street on his crutches. And managed to get into a cab and get the hell out of there before he was killed or beaten or whatever by his own workers. Amazing. And so then that's when he came back. But painting my mum, he did hundreds and hundreds of paintings of my mum. You know, I lived with naked mums all throughout my, everywhere. Naked, mum naked like this, naked. And watercolors of her. She was sort of his muse, but, you know, and he didn't really talk about those pictures or talk about painting her. She does. She talks about those pictures a lot and sitting for him. You know.
Were they reconciled?
Were they what?
Reconciled, your mum and dad?
Yes, they were. I mean, you know, he was ill, so he wasn't much use to her particularly, and he had no. So, but she never left him. I mean, she'd go off for months, but she'd come back. She looked after, you know, there were people to look after him right at the end. And she still misses him very much. I mean, I was with her today and she said, we went to a funeral and she said, you know, your dad is the only one I really loved. So that, you know, she still, it was a very passionate relationship that between those two. I mean, it was quite a sort of unusual relationship. You don't usually have that kind of passionate relationship with people, but they were very connected, very connected with the work, very connected with each other. You know, it's funny you say that. It's a great irony between the two in that he painted her 100 times and she never painted him once. And yet his pictures are not ever about her, but nearly all her pictures are about him. You know, the dog women, I don't know if you know her work, but the dog women are about him, the abortion pictures are sort of about him, for reasons. But Padre Amaro, O Crime de Padre Amaro, all those series of stories telling, a large number of the works are about him. He sort of, after his death, became, and even before his death, the pictures you would have seen at Edward Tota, girl and dog pictures, are about a girl looking after a dog, and the dog is him. And the girl is her, even though she never looked after him, because she couldn't be bothered to be looking after him, but she'd feel like she was, you know, and she'd paint pictures, which was her way of doing it. So that love affair even continues now, in a way. I mean, I'm calling it a love affair, but, you know, that relationship is still reflected in her work today, amazingly. I mean, I only know this from being exposed to it. I mean, I also went to film school, and it did the same to me. You know, as a filmmaker, I went to film school. But, and what he did talk a lot about education. He felt it was very important. He felt it was not well taught. He thought that we should pay students to work. He was that guy, you know. He felt that we should invest in them for as long as it takes, and that we should encourage he was always the one who liked the oddest of the paintings, or the oddest of the students, that everybody else ganged up on. He was the one that went in, oh, that's very interesting. Well, then tell me about that. You know, and he wanted people to talk about it. He thought that even if you talk badly about your work, he wanted to hear about it as well, you know. He did teach at Chelsea and Corsham. He was one of the first to teach at Corsham, you know, which was this groundbreaking art school, one of the sort of amazing art schools of the 60s. A guy called Michael Craig Martin also taught there later on. And he taught at Chelsea. And I think the Slade, he probably went back grudgingly and taught there. I mean, I think this is the thing, is how to maybe not necessarily forget what you've learned, in his opinion, but allow the child in you, the passionate, innocent thing that nobody cares about, that has no use in the world. This is a direct quote from him, is that it's the part of him that has no use, that can't work, can't earn money, has no place in the world, is the part that's the most important in painting the pictures. And that's something you've got to you've sort of got to allow that part of you, his view, to dominate and go past all the other things that you've learned and all
the knowledge and what you learned would be like compost, where this other part
can grow, yeah, and that you might, exactly, compost is a perfect, you know, mushrooms and that, but yes, that perhaps it will help, if it's helping nurture that part of you, then that's a good thing. But it takes many years to figure out how to do this, and it's different for everybody, isn't it? My mother's a completely different kind of artist. She was doing this from the beginning and kept doing it and never, you know, she was just blah all the time. And learned technique at the end rather than the beginning. There's sort of, you know, and the other artists, you've got to, you know, find your own thing, I suppose. I don't know. But good luck to you, Jesus Christ.
It's a good way to end. Okay, I think that's...
Thank you.
That's us, thank you.